There are wounds, not on the flesh. They rot beneath the earth. They take root in the blood of the living. And then they demand to return. A wild horse, buried alive. A ghost rising from the earth. A man, dragged back to the gallows of his past by the very memories that betrayed him. When the earth no longer stays silent, when the ashes rise from the grave, will you keep turning a deaf ear? Or kneel before the judgment you once tried to forget? Tonight, it's not the wild horse returning. It is the resurrection of everything that should have been buried forever. Beneath the rotting black mud, there is a heartbeat gasping for life, and a soul refusing to disappear. But to hear that final breath, you need someone who has known what it is to be buried. Someone who has lived their entire life, like a silent scar on the face of the earth. Elias Ward wasn't the kind of man people remembered. He existed quietly, like the withered cacti clinging to the edges of Sage Hollow, hardened, silent, and stubborn as fossilized stone. In his 60 years on this earth, Elias had watched harvests wither, entire families abandon their homesteads, and storms rip the roofs off the barns his father had built with bare hands. He didn't believe in miracles. He didn't believe in things unseen. He believed in the land, that wild, red earth that swallowed more than it ever returned. Mason Callahan, the only man Elias called a friend, carried a soul just as scarred. Mason's blue eyes, once bright in youth, had learned to narrow, to see through the things others chose to ignore. They both knew this land harbored secrets. But they chose silence. Because sometimes, in a land of survivors, silence was the only thing that kept you breathing. That day, the sky over Sage Hollow tore apart under iron-gray clouds. 3 days and nights of rain had turned the southern fields into a vast, seething bog, the air choked with the smell of rotting moss, sour grass, and something worse, like the earth itself was weeping. Elias leaned heavily on his old walking stick, slogging through the sludge one grueling step at a time. Mason followed close behind, shoulders burdened by a battered coil of rope slung across his back. They spoke no words. None were needed. Only the sound of water squelching underfoot, the wind shrieking through the skeletal trees, and then something else. A cry. Choked. Not human. Not animal. But something caught between the last desperate gasp of life and the long pull of death. They froze. The wind shifted, carrying the sound straight into their marrow, jagged, broken, raw. No discussion was needed. They ran. At the far edge of the field, where the black mire belched bubbles like the dying sobs of some buried thing, they saw it. A gaping fissure, torn wide open like the yawning mouth of the earth. Inside it, a creature clinging desperately to the mud, only its head protruding from the surface. A horse. No, half a horse, mired in blood and filth, trembling and alive. The black muck slicked its mane into dripping, rotted ropes. Its ears were folded and broken. Its eyes, half-lidded, stared out blankly, as if its soul hovered somewhere between clinging and surrendering. Mason reacted first. He slid down the bank without hesitation. "Elias," he gasped, his breath clouding in the bitter cold. Elias didn't need a second call. He tossed the stick aside and plunged into the mire. The freezing sludge tore through his clothes, clawing at his skin. Each step was a battle against the land itself, trying to suck them both under. They dropped to their knees beside the dying creature. Mud seeped into every crack in their hands, burning like acid in old wounds. The rescue began. Mason slipped the rope under the horse's chest, working with frantic care. Elias clawed through the heavy sludge beneath the animal's belly, trying to free it. No words. Only ragged breaths. The sickening squelch of mud. The choked sob of a creature teetering on the edge. The horse didn't fight. It had no strength left. Only shallow, fluttering breaths, breaking like spider silk between life and death. First pull, failure. The horse sank deeper. Second pull, failure. Mason's face drained of color, panic flashing in his eyes. We can't let it sink. Elias growled through gritted teeth, not sure if he spoke to Mason, the horse, or himself. Third pull. Every ounce of strength, every shard of fury and desperation they had left poured into that fraying rope. A sound tore through the air, the earth ripping, the sludge shrieking. And then, with a sickening heave, the horse's silver-gray body wrenched free from the pit, slamming onto the frozen, muddy ground, shuddering in spasms, before collapsing into stillness. Like a door slamming shut between life and death. Elias and Mason collapsed beside it, gasping for air, hands bloodied, faces streaked with grime and sweat. Before them, the horse lay motionless, coated in mud, its ribs heaving weakly. Its eyes fluttered shut, still battling whatever invisible force clawed at it. A cold wind swept across the barren field, carrying the stench of rotted earth, rusted iron, and something else. The stench of something awakening. Elias sank to his knees. His hand, trembling, reached out and touched the muck-caked shoulder of the beast. A breath caught in his throat. Not his own. Not the horse's. But the breath of the earth itself. The earth whispering. And in that moment, with the frost biting deep and despair hanging low, a question drove itself into Elias's mind like a blade. Why was a creature like this buried alive here? Not by accident. Not by chance. Sage Hollow had swallowed many things. But Elias knew. It only buried what men wanted to forget. Ashen Spirit didn't resist. He didn't thrash. He didn't cry out. He simply lay there, a silver-gray scrap against a sea of black, suffocating mud. Breathing in shallow, ragged gasps like the shattered sighs of a dying mountain. Elias plunged both hands deep into the mire, every movement tearing pain through to his ribs and lungs. Mason, his face streaked with mud, hurriedly looped the fraying rope around the horse's battered chest, his fingers trembling from cold and sheer exhaustion. Now! Mason barked through clenched teeth. Elias nodded. Two men, two souls battered by land and time, pulled with everything they had against the frayed rope. Pull. Mud splattered into their eyes, into their mouths. Ashen Spirit slid forward an inch, then sank deeper again. Pull. The earth roared beneath them, refusing to surrender its prey. Another wave of muck engulfed the horse's shoulders, dragging Mason halfway down into the pit. Pull. The tearing sound of earth splitting, the silent screaming of will and flesh. Elias felt his shoulder tear, his muscles screaming. But he didn't stop. He couldn't. And then, with one brutal heave that tore every fiber of their beings, the silver body broke free of the sucking mud, crashed hard onto the frozen ground, and lay there, shivering violently. Elias and Mason collapsed beside him, gasping. Their breath pouring into the cold air in thick, smoky clouds, mingling with the stench of mud, blood, sweat, and something deeper, the smell of life itself barely clinging to the blade of death. Before them, Ashen Spirit lay motionless. Mud coated him from ears to hooves. His back quivered with tiny, frail tremors, each one a desperate stand between existence and oblivion. Elias struggled upright. And right then, Ashen Spirit opened his eyes. It wasn't a frantic, wild-eyed gaze of a wounded animal. It wasn't a desperate search for escape. It was a look. Clear. Profound. Terrifyingly calm. as if he had been here long before this world ever learned to breathe. Elias felt the blood in his veins freeze solid. He pressed his trembling hands into the frozen ground, shaking not from cold, but from something deeper. The feeling of his soul being stripped bare. Ashen Spirit didn't look at his battered body. Didn't see the blood, the bruises. He looked straight through him, into the part Elias had spent a lifetime burying. Ashen Spirit didn't blink. Even as his battered body shivered, even with blood and muck clinging to his matted coat. His gaze held steady, fixed on Elias. No anger. No pleading. No forgiveness. Only presence. A heavy, overwhelming presence, as if his very soul had risen out of the mud to confront Elias. Elias knelt there in the frozen sludge, his whole body quivering under a cold no storm could ever create. Because he understood. What flickered in those silver-gray eyes was not the present. It was summers that had rotted away. Promises broken and crumbled. And fragments of a past Elias had tried to bury deeper than the graves and the dead fields. Ashen Spirit watched him. Not with the eyes of a horse, but with the eyes of an ancient soul. One who had weathered 1,000 storms. One who had witnessed humanity kneeling before their own darkness. And still waited. Waited for something. For redemption. For an unkept vow. Elias clutched at his chest, muddy hands pressing against his shirt like he feared his heart might tear itself apart. His breath came in ragged punches, hammering against his ribs like blind fists. A part of him wanted to run. Away from the gaze. Away from the memory. But his legs wouldn't move. They rooted him there. Like the dead trees still standing after the fire had stripped them bare. The world shrank down to nothing. Only he and the creature remained. Even Mason, standing just a few feet away, faded from his senses. Even the heavy, cloud-choked sky became distant and unreal. There was only that gaze. The eyes of Ashen Spirit. Eyes that opened a gate to everything Elias had never dared to remember. And could never quite forget. And then, Elias felt it. Not a word. Not a thought. But a question whispered into the very marrow of his bones. Do you remember? It didn't need to be spoken aloud. It didn't need to be translated. It shot straight into the deepest part of Elias. Into the child he had buried long ago. The boy with small, powerless hands and a heart swollen with guilt. Ashen Spirit blinked once. Slowly. Heavily. As if centuries had passed between each breath. And Elias. Elias knew. Without doubt. This horse had known him. Had seen him. Had once touched his soul. In another life. In another time he had fought so hard to forget. A gust of wind screamed across the hollow, rattling the broken stable door. Somewhere in the distance, an owl cried out, a hollow, lonely sound. But Elias didn't hear it. He heard only the silent roar of his own heart. And a broken whisper rising from somewhere deep within. I remember you. Ashen Spirit turned his head slowly. Almost as if confirming what he had needed to know. Elias dropped his hand from his chest, feeling the muddy slime trailing down his palm like old blood resurfacing from a forgotten grave. He knew. This was only the beginning. No one commanded. No one urged him on. Ashen Spirit, after piercing through Elias across the vastness of time, rose to his feet by his own will. His legs trembled, scarred and bleeding. Yet his eyes, they didn't shatter. Mud clung to his coat, falling away in clumps. As if each clump peeled off a buried memory. Mason instinctively backed away, hands gripping the worn rope tighter, suspicion flashing in his eyes. But Ashen didn't spook. Didn't bolt. He walked. deliberate, purposeful, as if he knew exactly where he was meant to go. Elias froze. Every fiber of instinct screamed. Corral him. Tie him down. Do what men had always done to wild things. But deeper, beneath the instincts, his soul whispered, "No. Let him choose." Ashen Spirit limped across the field, his every step silent but weighty, toward the old stables, the forgotten corner of the ranch, where the smell of rotted wood and earth clung like ancient sorrow, where termite-eaten beams leaned in surrender, where Elias, once upon a time, had hidden a trembling, wounded foal from the merciless world. The wind howled harder, ripping the tarps off the decrepit stalls, stirring the sense of old sweat, damp earth, and something else. The feeling of time tearing itself apart at the seams. Ashen Spirit passed through the sagging gate without hesitation. Didn't flinch. Didn't look back. He walked like a man returning home. To a home that had once been stolen from him. Elias followed. Not leading. Not chasing. Drawn, pulled forward by an invisible thread. The unpayable debt of a broken promise. Ashen Spirit stopped before a specific stall. One near the end of the row. Elias knew this place. It was here, at 11 years old. He had scattered dry hay under a battered, bleeding colt. Whispered foolish vows to protect it. To never let harm come near. It was here. He had failed. Ashen lowered his head, nudging the splintered latch with his muzzle. A motion as soft as breathing. But it smashed through Elias like a wrecking ball. Mason approached carefully. "You want to lock him in there?" he asked hesitantly. Elias didn't answer immediately. He placed his calloused hand on the latch. His fingers, hardened from a lifetime working this brutal land, trembled. Not from fear of the horse, but fear of facing the child he once was. The boy who still sat, knees tucked to chest, in the corner of this stall. Heart shattered in the silence. Elias unlatched the gate. It swung open with a groan, like the death rattle of old bones. Ashen Spirit didn't hesitate. He stepped inside. Slow, regal, like an exiled king reclaiming a throne lost to dust. He turned and locked eyes with Elias once more. A brief glance. Enough to pull Elias deeper into the abyss inside himself. Ashen lay down in the straw, unafraid, unguarded, as if he knew. This place had once belonged to him. Elias stood outside the stall. Mason murmured, You see it too, don't you?" Elias only nodded, afraid that speaking would tear open the world he had sealed away for 50 long years. Outside, the wind howled across Sage Hollow, carrying the stench of rotted mud, old moss, and the whispers of things long buried. Inside the stall, Ashen Spirit kept his eyes half open, watching Elias, anchoring him to the weight of a silent verdict. Elias clenched his fists at his sides. A new fear, deeper than death, crept into his bones. Not the fear of the creature before him, but the terror of facing the man he had once been. Elias stood rigid by the stall gate, fists balled so tightly his knuckles whitened. Outside, the wind sliced across the fields like knives. Inside him, a deeper cold was unraveling. The freezing, brutal cold of old memories clawing their way free. Ashen Spirit closed his eyes. Not to sleep, but to wait. To wait for Elias to open the last door he had locked inside himself. And it began. No warning. No mercy. Elias saw himself. A skinny, mud-caked boy, slipping through a broken fence under the choking heat of a long-ago summer night. Moonlight spilled onto the battered old barn. And there, curled in the straw, shivering, was a foal. Gray, trembling, blood seeping from a gash along its flank. Its pain. Its terror. They latched onto the boy like cold iron hooks. Elias knelt, extended a hand caked with grime, gently touching the foal's matted coat. The colt flinched, but did not flee. It only looked at him, with eyes so young, so heartbreakingly trusting. That night, Elias made a promise. I won't let them take you. A simple vow. Fragile. Childish. But to a boy abandoned by the world, it was sacred. He snuck out each night, smuggled water, gathered dry grass, tended the colt's wounds. Even when his father, a harsh man who saw wild horses as vermin, warned him, stay away from those filthy beasts. They'll only bring you trouble. Elias didn't care. In the loneliness of his childhood, that little creature had been the only living thing. To listen without judgment. To trust without conditions. Until that night. The night everything broke. The screech of truck tires outside the gate. Headlights slicing through the trees, cutting across the old barn like blades. Elias jerked awake from his makeshift bed of straw. Heavy boots thundered closer. His father's growl, the barking of dogs, the clank of chains. The stall door burst open with a savage kick. A rough hand seized the boy and flung him aside. The colt shrieked. A cry of pure, ragged terror, splitting the night like a knife into soft flesh. Men poured into the stall, ropes and halters in hand. They looped the colt's neck, dragging it away as it fought, as it screamed, reaching for the boy with wild, desperate eyes. Elias stood frozen, feet rooted, mouth open, wanting to scream, to run, to fight, but paralyzed. His father's voice roared behind him. Don't be a fool. Wild horses are nothing but trouble. Let them take it. And Elias, the boy with tear-blurred eyes, turned away. He let them drag the colt up into the waiting truck. Let the final, heart-wrenching scream vanish into the night. The headlights vanished. The dust settled. All that remained was silence, and a vow broken beyond repair. Elias jolted awake from the nightmare, sweat cold as ice on his skin, though the night wind could have cut a man to bone. In front of him, Ashen Spirit still lay silent, not fleeing, not accusing, simply waiting, guarding something. Elias forced himself toward the stall gate. A few feet. It felt like miles. Ashen Spirit opened his eyes. That same silver gray, burning low beneath the dim barn light. Not the eyes of an animal. The eyes of a soul that had never stopped waiting. The gaze hit Elias like a thunderclap to the chest. No need for spoken words. No accusations. No anger. Just the unbearable weight of truth. You turned your back on me. Elias crumpled to his knees beside the door. His fingernails scraped into the rotting wood. Not begging. Not justifying. Just trying not to scream from the ripping pain inside his chest. In that moment, Elias understood. Ashen Spirit hadn't come back to punish him. He had come back to ask. This time, will you keep your promise? Outside, Sage Hollow lay still. Dead still. No wind. No crickets. No whisper of life. Only the low, steady breathing of Ashen Spirit, humming through the ancient boards of the barn. Elias sat against the splintered wood, hands clenched so hard blood beaded at his knuckles. Eyes hollow. Chest cracked wide open. That night, no one slept. Not man. Not horse. Not land. All of Sage Hollow listened. Listened to the thrum of an old promise, beating faint but steady against the night. In the darkness, Elias whispered, "I remember you." A breath of a promise. Small enough to be lost in the wind, but heavy enough to make his eyes sting with tears. Ashen's spirit shifted slightly. Not to leave. Not to escape. But to draw himself tighter. As if gathering every shred of warmth left between two souls finally reconnecting after a lifetime adrift. And in the silence of that broken night, between man and horse, no words were needed. Only the silent vow. This time, I won't leave you behind. The night at Sage Hollow held its breath. Every sound, the wind, the crickets, even the beat of a heart, seemed to dissolve into a thick, suffocating silence. Only Ashen's spirit remained, lying there, still, as if he were part of the earth, part of the wind, part of the ancient secrets buried deep beneath the blood-red soil. And then, a sound, a noise that didn't belong to this world. Ashen's spirit let out a cry. Not high-pitched like a frightened colt. Not desperate like a wounded beast. But a sound deep and strange, rising from the very pit of his chest, as if pulling along with it the scattered souls mankind had long forgotten. The call tore through the darkness, rushing down the skeletal lines of dead trees, skimming across the hardened, lifeless fields, touching every moss-covered stone, echoing back from places Elias had never dared to tread. Elias sat bolt upright, heart hammering in his chest. Mason muttered a curse under his breath. Both men knew this was no call for help. It wasn't a cry for companionship. Ashen's spirit was calling for something else. Something that had rotted with time. Something Sage Hollow had once hoped was buried forever beneath its cracked earth. The call faded, leaving behind a void heavier than the creak of a coffin lid. Elias stood frozen, arms slack at his sides, too afraid to utter a word, because he understood. Tonight, Sage Hollow would never be the same again. A tremor ran through the ground. Far, far away, like the heartbeat of Mother Earth herself, came a faint, rhythmic pounding. Mason gritted his teeth, squinting into the dark. "You hear that?" he whispered. Elias didn't answer. He heard it. He felt it too. The pounding of hooves. Heavy. Measured. Not the frantic beat of a herd fleeing. Not the scattered chaos of panicked animals. But synchronized. Steady. Certain. Elias stepped out from the barn's eaves, the flickering lantern trembling in his hand. His gaze swept the dense darkness. And then, he saw them. At the edge of the southern ridge, under the cold, sharp moonlight. A band of wild Mustangs. 7 of them. Their coats blurred into the night and the earth. Their eyes flashing with an eerie light, as if ignited from beneath the ground itself. Leading them, a black mare with a white blaze down her forehead. Behind her, strong bodies. A buckskin stallion. A pale roan speckled like ashes. And other dark shapes too shadowed to make out. The herd showed no fear. No hesitation. No scanning the horizon. They weren't running from anything. They were looking for someone. For who? Elias didn't have to ask. Because in that very moment, Ashen's spirit braced his legs under him. His whole frame trembling. But his head lifted high, his gaze locked straight on the approaching band. A lighthouse in a desert of death. Ashen's spirit wasn't calling for rescue. Ashen's spirit was awakening the ghosts of memory. The Mustang band halted at the foot of the hill. The black mare stepped forward, lifting her head proudly. Across the empty field, Ashen Spirit answered with another cry. Lower this time. A call so deep it seemed to seep from the grave itself. The black mare answered back. Not loudly, but with a sound that sank into the earth and made the bones of Sage Hollow hum. And then, no roaring, no chaotic shrieks. The herd began to move. Slowly, in unison, as if every step had been etched into the fabric of time long before they were ever born. Elias stood rooted to the ground. Mason cursed aloud, backing up instinctively. But neither man could tear their eyes away. Because they knew. This wasn't the return of animals. This was the resurrection of memory. Ashen Spirit stepped out of the barn. His legs shaky, his body battered. But his head still held high. An old man and a horse. Separated by only a few steps. Elias shook with the effort not to fall to his knees. Ashen Spirit walked straight toward the herd. No hesitation. No backward glance. No need. The black mare dipped her head in greeting as Ashen approached. The others circled him, nuzzling, sniffing, snorting softly. No screaming. No fighting. Only recognition. A circle formed. A silent ritual. No words. No witnesses required. Ashen Spirit hadn't called them to save him. He had called them to complete a bond broken half a century ago. Elias swallowed hard against the knot in his throat. No one had told him this would happen. No one could have warned him. He understood. Tonight, it wasn't just the wild horses returning. It was his own soul, long decayed and buried, that was being unearthed from the ground. That morning, Sage Hollow was unnaturally silent. No roosters crowing. No wind whispering through the scorched grass. Not even the distant echo of hooves from the hills. Only silence. A heavy, unsettling silence. As if the entire land were holding its breath, waiting for something inevitable. Elias stood on the front porch, his gaze fixed southeast. Toward a barren stretch of cracked earth, sprawling like an old scar across the face of the land. The place his father had once called the cursed ground. No one farmed it. No one built on it. No one stepped foot there, except for the lost, and those who never returned. Mason stepped silently onto the porch behind Elias, an old storm lantern dangling from his hand. Trailing behind them was Jonah Reese, Elias's younger cousin, recently returned from the upper valleys, his eyes wearied but filled with a stubborn resolve. No words were needed. Elias gave a single nod. A simple nod. But one that carried the weight of a sentence they all might not survive. 3 men. 3 generations carrying the sins of the land. Set out. The scorched ground welcomed them with waves of searing heat rising from its depths, even though the sun had barely climbed over the horizon. Each step on the cracked soil snapped like breaking bones. Jonah dropped his shovel into the dirt, lifted his head toward Elias. "You sure about this?" he asked, voice low and hoarse. Elias tightened his grip around the old pickaxe. His eyes never left the split in the earth beneath them. "If we don't dig it up, we'll never understand why we can't sleep at night." And so they began. Pickaxes. Shovels. Bare hands. Ripping into the hardened earth, inch by inch. Sweat poured in streams. Dirt sprayed into their eyes, their mouths, ground into the cuts splitting open across their hands. Jonah muttered between gasps. "What the hell are we even looking for?" Elias said nothing. He just dug. Face down. Body bent. Because deep inside, he knew. What they were about to uncover wasn't just soil. Mason's pickaxe struck something hard. Clang. A sharp, metallic sound that cut through the morning air like a blade through flesh. The three men froze. Elias dropped to his knees, clawing at the dirt with raw, trembling hands. A fragment of rotten wood surfaced. An old wooden box, barely clinging to shape after decades buried under time and silence. Mason cursed under his breath. Jonah held still, barely breathing. Elias pried open the box, the wood crumbling in his hands. Inside. Not gold. Not forgotten treasure. Only tiny fragments of bone. And a corroded metal tag. Elias lifted the tag, wiping away layers of mud and decay. The engraving was faint but still readable. Sage Hollow Mass Removal, 1983. A chill knifed down Elias's spine. Mason stepped back, his hands trembling. Jonah whispered, "Mass removal means extermination?" No one answered. There was no need for an answer. They kept digging. Box after box emerged from the soil. More. Deeper. Scattered like forgotten graves. And inside each one, horse bones. Small skeletons, many with deep grooves on their spines. Grooves left by ropes pulled too tight. Some still bore the scorch marks of branding irons. Marks burned not to claim, but to erase. Elias collapsed beside one of the open graves. His hand brushed a tiny shard of bone, so delicate it could only belong to a foal. Tears spilled silently from his eyes, mixing into the blood-red dust. The truth finally lay bare under the heavy, gray light. 30 years ago, when the population grew and land became currency, the local authorities had ordered the secret extermination of Sage Hollow's wild Mustangs. Not openly. Not with declarations. Not leaving a trace. They buried them. Old ones. Young ones still wobbling on unsteady legs. Burying them alive. Burying them dead. It made no difference. All of it. Just to clear space for endless fields of corn. For sprawling subdivisions that spread across the land like a disease. And Elias, somewhere deep inside, had always known. He just never had the courage to dig deep enough until now. Mason sank to the ground, his hands shaking uncontrollably. Jonah turned away and vomited into the dust. And Elias. He only knelt there, his hands coated in the ash of the dead, feeling his heart shatter like the scorched earth beneath him. Ashen Spirit hadn't just called the herd back. Ashen Spirit had called memory, had called guilt, had called truth. And now, there was no turning back. Ashen Spirit did not leave. He stood there, amidst the scattered bones and rotting wooden coffins, facing the three men who had collapsed into the blood-soaked mud of history. The eastern wind whipped up clouds of dust into swirling eddies. But Ashen Spirit remained still, his head held high, eyes wide open. He stared across the field as if standing watch, refusing to let anyone forget, refusing to let anything else be buried beneath this rotting earth. Elias hunched over, as if an invisible weight had come crashing down on him. He understood. Ashen Spirit was demanding something Elias had spent his entire life avoiding. No more turning away. No more deafness. No more forgetting. The sound of hoofbeats echoed, steady, rhythmic, like the beating of ancient war drums from the heart of the earth. Jonah turned and held his breath. A herd of Mustangs, ghosts of the land, emerged from the darkness, moving slowly, encircling Ashen Spirit. No shrieking, no frantic cries, no signs of threat. They simply walked, step by step, tracing a perfect circle around Ashen and the field of white bones. Each hooffall stamped something permanent into the soil. Each revolution whispered a silent incantation, calling back the forsaken spirits. Ashen's spirit stood motionless at the center. No sound. No flinch. Only stillness, allowing the soul of Sage Hollow to gather around him, like shards of a shattered mirror finding their way home. Elias trembled. Mason instinctively lowered himself to one knee. No one needed to be told. No commands were necessary, because this was no longer a ritual of men. It was a rite of the land itself. A silent proclamation. The betrayed had returned, and the betrayers must bow. Elias staggered forward, his legs heavy as if chained to the earth. He walked toward Ashen's spirit, toward the herd of Mustangs standing like ancient gods. Ashen's spirit turned, his silver gaze slicing through Elias like ice. No judgment, no fury, only a question. Silent, piercing. This time, what will you choose? Elias stopped. Just one step away. One small step. Longer than a lifetime. In that breathless space, everything came rushing back. The cries from that night. The wild, panicked hooves scraping against the earth. His father's scarred face shouting, "Shut your eyes, boy. Shut them and live." Elias trembled. His fists clenched so tightly that blood welled from his palms. His heart slammed against his ribs, begging to shatter free. He lifted his head. His eyes were bloodshot but blazing. Elias looked directly at Ashen's spirit. And for the first time in 60 years, he did not step back. Elias turned, locking eyes with Mason and Jonah. Both silent, both waiting for a verdict. Elias tightened his fists, his voice cracking with a force he could barely contain. No more burying. No more blindfolds. We open it up. We show the world. Mason nodded quietly. Jonah gripped the handle of his shovel tighter, a flicker of hope lighting his face. Ashen's spirit took a step forward, lowered his head, and pressed it lightly against Elias's chest. A silent gesture of acceptance. The herd of Mustangs stopped moving. The circle of remembrance sealed itself. From that fractured, scorched earth, a new vow was born. Sage Hollow would no longer be the land of lies. It would become a land of memory and redemption. The first light of morning began to break. It spilled over the scorched field, illuminating the white bones, the cracked soil, the men kneeling before the unvarnished truth. Elias placed his hand gently on Ashen's spirit's neck. No longer begging, no longer seeking forgiveness, but making a vow. I won't blind myself again. I won't turn away. I will tell it all. I swear it. Ashen's spirit closed his eyes. The wind rose, lifting dust and ash high into the pale sky. A low, distant whinny echoed across the hills. And so, in Sage Hollow, under the first light of a new dawn, a soul was redeemed. A promise was reborn. And the land began to breathe again. The sky above Sage Hollow faded from the color of blood, giving way to the silver light of dawn. Ashen's spirit did not rush. He stood still, like a statue carved from ash and wind, at the center of the circle of Mustangs. The herd slowly parted. No command was given. No whinny broke the air. No whip, no reins. They moved on their own, as if souls returning to the site of their own burial. Ashen's spirit led the way. His steps were faltering but determined, heading straight toward the crumbling stalls, the line where freedom and captivity once blurred. Elias gripped the rotting fence with white-knuckled hands. Mason and Jonah followed silently, witnesses to a ceremony older than memory itself. The morning breeze swept through, lifting the fine dust of old bones into the air, clearing the path for a spirit seeking its final place of belonging. Ashen Spirit approached the old row of stalls, peeling, sagging, still bearing the marks of rusted nails and rotted ropes. He stopped at the third stall. His ears quivered slightly, as if hearing the silent sobs still trapped within the decaying wood. The herd followed. Each horse chose a stall, without fighting, without hesitation. Their hoofbeats echoed like slow funeral drums. Their wild eyes swept over Elias and Jonah, not with hatred, but as a solemn reminder. We remember, and we have returned to carve memory into this land. Ashen Spirit turned his head. His silver gaze locked onto Elias, sharp as frostbite. A slight nod, a silent signal. Elias understood. Trembling, he stepped forward, his hand tracing the old, splintered door. The carved letters, though weathered, were still there. Wild One, Summer 83. In that instant, time ripped open like a thin veil. Elias heard it, clear as the first time. A child's muffled sobs. A young foal's screams, ripped from its throat as it was dragged away. The cold, commanding voices of men with no souls left to lose. He pressed his forehead against the wood, squeezing his eyes shut. One breath, deep and violent enough to tear him apart. I'm sorry. Ashen Spirit took one step back. No roaring, no high-pitched scream. He bowed his head low, his silver-gray body trembling like grass in a coming storm. And then, with a dignity born from silence, Ashen Spirit knelt down on the old straw-covered ground, right at the threshold of that stall, the very place where Elias had once sworn to protect a life, and broken that vow. The world seemed to hold its breath. The entire herd lowered their heads in unison, following Ashen's lead. It was not about the humans. It was about the betrayed, the forgotten, the erased from history. Elias collapsed onto his knees in the dirt, his hands clawed into the earth, as if trying to anchor himself to something, anything, that hadn't already been lost. Ashen Spirit did not open his eyes. He simply lay there, silent, heavy with the weight of 100 lifetimes worth of memory. And Elias understood. This was no mere redemption. It was a festival of memory, an indelible engraving on the very soul of this land. The morning light poured into the old barnyard. The first rays bathed Ashen Spirit's back in a halo of muted gold, like a burial shroud woven from dust and light. Jonah whispered hoarsely, "He's becoming sacred." Elias clutched the splintered stall door. Tears streamed down his withered face. No longer tears of fear, nor of regret, but of a solemn vow, a commitment. "We will not forget you." Ashen Spirit stirred slightly. One deep breath, long, steady, and then stillness. But it was not death. It was not surrender. It was a passing on, a bequeathing, a new pulse sown deep into this burned and battered land. Elias leaned his forehead against the stall wall, breathing in the scent of old wood, sweat, and dust. And for the first time in 40 years, Sage Hollow itself breathed out a long, shuddering sigh. Morning light spread over Sage Hollow like a thin, pale shroud. The wind swept across the scorched fields, across the motionless Mustangs, over the still body of Ashen Spirit. And finally, it reached Elias, kneeling among the mud and bones. He hadn't yet found the strength to rise. Because in that instant, from within the circle of Mustangs, a small movement stirred the thick, brittle air. A young life. A foal. Its coat, unlike Ashen's, was not silver gray. It burned a deep, smoldering red. Like embers still hot after a wildfire. Dust gray clung to it, as if Sage Hollow itself had risen up in flesh and bone. That foal, with deep brown eyes, dark and blazing like coals beneath ash. A gaze, so hauntingly familiar it chilled the blood. Elias gripped the splintered fence post, heart pounding out of rhythm. Those eyes weren't just looking at him. They were recognizing him. They were calling his name. Without a single word, the foal slowly stepped out from the Mustang circle, its thin legs trembling, but its eyes steady, fierce, speaking a silent truth that needed no voice. Jonah froze in place. Mason whispered hoarsely, "Dear God, it's..." But he couldn't finish. No one could. Only Elias' heart answered. A slow, devastating realization. Ashen didn't come back for me. The young foal walked straight toward Elias. No flinching. No hesitation. It moved like a deep red arrow, piercing straight through the wasteland of Elias' torn-apart soul. Its eyes burned beneath the weak morning sun. An impossible fusion of newborn innocence and ancient memory. Elias gasped, stumbled forward a step, then dropped to his knees, hands hanging limp by his sides. Not out of surrender, but because he understood. He was standing before a sacred legacy. The foal drew closer. Only a breath's distance now. Elias, trembling, extended a hand. Not commanding, not coaxing. Crimson dust. The name burst unbidden into his mind like a whisper from the earth itself. Pressed its soft muzzle into Elias' palm. A single, gentle touch. But it was enough to set fire to every frozen layer Elias had ever built around his heart for the last 60 years. And in that moment, Elias understood. Ashen hadn't returned for himself. Ashen had returned to entrust something. To entrust a new generation. To entrust a new soul. A living ember still strong enough to redeem a land once scorched by betrayal. Crimson dust lifted its head, fixing Elias with a stare. Not like a wild animal sizing up a human, but like a child, recognizing the father they had never known. The herd of Mustangs shifted, parting without a sound. They formed a living corridor, a path leading from the graveyard of bones back to the crumbling barn. Crimson dust turned, swishing its tail gently. An invitation. A calling. Elias staggered to his feet, knees trembling, heart thundering against his ribs. He followed the young foal, each step crushing old ashes underfoot, each step breathing a new life into the forgotten soil. The sky above Sage Hollow flushed pink. The wind swept through the piles of ash, lifting them into the air. And in that fleeting moment, Elias could almost hear the ghostly laughter of a child echoing back from summers long since decayed. And beneath the dew-wet light of the newborn morning, this land, which had once lain dead and silent, breathed again. The morning breeze had softened. A silver haze of light glittered across the dew-soaked grass. No one spoke. No one dared to disturb the sacred silence that had settled over Sage Hollow. Ashen Spirit stood there, at the center of the Mustang corridor, like a scar stitched together from earth, blood, and memory. Elias gripped the splintered wooden fence, his calloused hand bleeding from the cracks. Yet he didn't cry. Not because he had no tears left, but because he understood. Some goodbyes needed no tears, no words, only stillness, only the courage to look and let the soul scream in silence. Crimson dust stood beside him, those burning brown eyes lifted upward, silently witnessing what no human words could ever capture. Ashen Spirit raised his head. One last time. His gaze swept across Sage Hollow, branding the land with a final seal. An indelible mark of forgiveness, or perhaps simply remembrance. And then, without a whinny, without a nudge, Ashen Spirit turned away. The Mustangs followed, one by one, step by step, in perfect, solemn rhythm. No panic, no fear, no hurry. They crossed the scorched field, passed over the graves and the bones, moving steadily toward the mist-covered hills in the west. The early fog rolled down from the ridges, thick and heavy, wrapping itself around each silhouette, blurring them, swallowing them whole, like spirits returning to where they truly belonged. Ashen Spirit led the way, head high, stride steady, even though the dust of betrayal still clung to his coat. Elias took a step forward, his lips parted, wanting to call, to shout, to reach out. But he stopped, because he understood. Ashen never belonged to him. Ashen never belonged to anyone. Ashen belonged to something larger. A freedom that could not be chained. A memory that could not be buried. The mist grew thicker. The herd disappeared into it, until only emptiness remained in front of Elias, and the soft sigh of the earth breathing again. Elias stood there, while the truth seeped into every fiber of his being. Ashen Spirit hadn't just survived. Ashen Spirit had carried memory home. Not for vengeance, not for pity, but to open a door. A door that would lead Sage Hollow out of its own buried guilt. Ashen didn't need to be saved by men. Ashen, through sheer spirit, through unyielding memory, had saved the land itself. He had summoned back what humanity had tried to erase. He had forced the living to look upon what they had abandoned. Elias clenched his fists, feeling the jagged edges of shame and awe slicing into his palms. A single tear, heavy as iron, slid down his weathered cheek. He whispered into the void, "I understand now, Ashen. I swear, I won't let it be forgotten again." Crimson dust approached. The young foal pressed his muzzle softly into Elias's chest. A touch so gentle, yet powerful enough to shatter every wall Elias had built around his heart. Elias collapsed to his knees, arms encircling the young Mustang's neck, his heartbeat syncing with the foal's quick, wild breaths. Ashen was gone. The broken promises were buried with him. But here stood Crimson Dust. Here remained Sage Hollow, scarred, but now standing honest under the sun. And in that sacred moment, Elias understood. Ashen had not left behind the past. Ashen had left behind the future. A new generation. A new spirit. A crimson fire that would never die. The truth is not always what you want to see. It can tear open wounds that have been buried deep. But at the same time, it is the only thing that helps us stand up. Never forget, wounds are not always on the surface. They sink deep into the soul, into parts we've forgotten. And then, they demand to be seen, to heal. This story is not just about a wild horse, but about everything we've left behind. About promises unkept, about memories that cannot be forgotten. We may run from the past, but we can't escape what has happened to our souls. So, what will you do when faced with the sins you've forgotten? When you are forced to confront yourself? This open conclusion is not an end, but a reminder. Don't let the wounds be buried again. Don't stay silent about what deserves to be spoken. Don't forget these lessons, for they are the key to saving ourselves. Share this story, because each story like this not only touches your heart, but can also change the world around you. Keep watching, seek the truths, the forgotten memories, and never be afraid to face yourself. Subscribe now so you won't miss the next powerful stories. Share and show everyone that, sometimes, the things we fear the most are the very things we need to face.